Our first story comes from a man I'll call Robart. He was 26 years old when this happened, working the night shift as a groundskeeper at a small family cemetery outside a town in rural Ohio. The kind of town with one gas station and a population sign that hadn't been updated in 15 years. He'd taken the job because it paid better than anything else nearby, and because the owner told him something strange during the interview. You don't need to be brave. You just need to follow the list. The list, Robart learned on his first night, was a set of instructions taped inside the maintenance shed. 6 rules. He remembers most of them clearly, even now. Rule 1. Never enter the cemetery after 11 p.m. unless the gate is already open. Rule 2. If you hear your name called from the tree line, do not answer and do not look toward the trees. Rule 3. The northeast corner, near the unmarked stones, is not to be mowed, touched, or photographed after dark. Robart thought it was superstition. Old cemetery folklore passed down from owner to owner. For the first 2 weeks, nothing happened. He mowed, he repaired fences, he locked the gate at sundown like he was told. It was boring, honestly. Peaceful, even. Then, on a Tuesday in October, he stayed late to finish trimming near the front section. The sun had already gone down. He told himself he'd be quick. 15 minutes, tops. At 10:52 p.m., he heard his name. Not shouted, not desperate, just said, calm, clear. Like someone standing 3 feet behind him had simply said, Robart, the way you'd get someone's attention in a quiet library. He remembered Rule 2 immediately. Don't answer. Don't look toward the trees. So, he didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the grass in front of him, gripped the trimmer tighter, and started walking. Not running, because some instinct told him running would be worse, toward the gate. The voice said his name again, closer this time. He said the walk to the gate, which normally took him under a minute, felt like it lasted 10. He could hear footsteps behind him on the gravel path. Slow, matching his pace exactly. When he sped up, they sped up. When he made himself slow down to test it, they slowed down too. He reached the gate, stepped through, and turned to lock it behind him. And that's when he finally looked. The cemetery was empty. No one on the path, no one near the trees. Just headstones and mist starting to settle low over the grass. But near the northeast corner, the unmarked stones, the section he was told never to touch after dark, he saw something standing perfectly still. Too tall to be a fence post, too still to be a person waiting. It didn't move while he watched. It didn't need to. He said the feeling wasn't that it was going to come toward him. The feeling was that it had already seen everything it needed to see. Robart locked the gate, got in his car, and didn't go back for 3 days. When he finally returned, the owner didn't ask why he'd missed his shifts. She just said, "You heard it, didn't you?" and handed him the schedule for the week, like nothing had happened. He worked there for another 8 months. He never broke a rule on that list again. To this day, Robart doesn't know who or what knew his name that night. He never found any record of who might be buried in that unmarked section. The cemetery's own records office had no information on it either. Just an empty plot of land the owner refused to explain, and a rule taped to a shed wall that everyone who worked there was told to memorize on day 1. Our second story takes us north, to a small coastal town in Nova Scotia. The viewer who sent this in, I'll call her Marie, was 17 years old at the time, and this happened at a cemetery attached to an old church her family had attended for generations. Marie's grandmother had passed away that spring, and Marie had taken to visiting the grave alone, usually in the early evening after school. She said it made her feel close to her, sitting there for 20 minutes before walking home. For the first few weeks, it was simple. quiet, just her, the wind off the water, and rows of old stones, some dating back over 100 years. Then, in early June, something changed. She arrived one evening and noticed the flowers she'd left on her grandmother's grave the day before had been moved. Not knocked over by wind, but placed neatly beside a different headstone about 10 feet away. An older stone, weathered almost smooth, the name barely legible. She thought maybe a groundskeeper had done it by mistake. She moved them back. The next day, they were moved again to the exact same spot. Marie started paying closer attention. She noticed the grass around that older, weathered headstone was always slightly flattened, like something sat or knelt there often, even though she never saw anyone else in the cemetery during her visits. She asked her mother about the name on the stone. Her mother didn't recognize it, and said as far as she knew, no one from their family or the town had visited that particular grave in years. One evening in late June, Marie stayed later than usual. The sun was almost down. She was about to leave when she heard something behind her. Not footsteps this time, but a sound like fabric dragging slowly across grass. She turned around. The old headstone, the weathered one, 10 feet from her grandmother's grave, was no longer where it had been. It was closer, maybe 6 feet away now, standing at a slightly different angle than before, like it had been physically dragged and repositioned. Marie said her first thought wasn't fear, it was confusion, because headstones like that weigh hundreds of pounds. They don't move. They can't move, not without heavy equipment and several people. But it had moved, and the grass behind it, in the direction it had come from, was pressed flat in a long, trailing line, like something had been pulled. She ran. She didn't look back, and she didn't stop until she was inside her house with the door locked. When she came back 3 days later, this time with her older cousin, the headstone was back in its original position, exactly where it had first been, as if it had never moved at all. Marie never went back to visit alone again. She still visits her grandmother's grave, but always in daylight, always with someone else, and she never brings flowers close to that older stone. She later found out from a distant relative that the name on the weathered headstone belonged to someone who had died alone, with no family left to visit, and that, according to town rumor, the grave had been reported as shifted by groundskeepers at least twice before, decades apart. No one had ever explained why. Our final story comes from the English countryside, a small village in Yorkshire, the kind with a single stone church older than the country records can properly date, and a churchyard cemetery surrounded by a low iron fence and a gate that's been locked every night for as long as anyone in the village can remember. The viewer, who I'll call Thomas, was in his early 30s when this happened. He'd recently moved back to his childhood village to help care for his elderly father, and one of his regular routines was walking their old dog past the churchyard each evening. The dog had always been calm, easygoing, the kind of dog that didn't bark at strangers or startle at loud noises, except near that gate. Every single evening, without fail, the dog would stop about 10 feet from the churchyard gate, refuse to go any closer, and stare directly at the same spot along the fence line. A spot with no headstone nearby, nothing visually different from the rest of the boundary. Thomas found it strange, but dogs are dogs. He assumed it was a scent, a fox maybe, or something buried in the hedgerow. Then, one October evening, walking later than usual because his father needed help before he left the house, he noticed the churchyard gate, which was always locked by the vicar before dusk, was standing open. Not swung open by wind, fully open, held that way, resting against the stone post, and standing just inside it, at the exact spot the dog always refused to approach, was a figure. He said it wasn't dressed strangely. No robes, no old-fashioned clothing like you'd expect from a story like this. Just a dark coat, unmoving, facing toward the church rather than toward him. Still enough that for a moment, he genuinely believed it might be a real person. The vicar, perhaps, or a visitor paying respects. He called out a polite evening out of habit. The figure didn't turn, but the dog, which had been silent and still the entire time, suddenly let out a sound Thomas said he'd never heard from it before or since. Not quite a bark, not quite a whine. A single, sharp sound, and then dead silence, like the dog had frightened itself into not making another one. Thomas pulled the dog gently and started walking, faster than he meant to. He didn't run. He told himself there was no reason to run, but he didn't look back either, not until he was well past the churchyard wall. When he finally did glance back, the gate was closed, locked, the way it always was, and there was no one standing anywhere near it.
He mentioned it to his father that night, expecting to be told it was nothing. Instead, his father went quiet for a moment and said, "Your grandfather used to say the same thing about that gate. Said it opens itself once or twice a year. Said you're not meant to see who it opens for."
Thomas asked the vicar about it weeks later, carefully, expecting an explanation about wind or a faulty latch. The vicar simply said the gate had a reputation in the village long before he arrived, and that he always double-checked the lock himself for exactly that reason. He didn't explain further, and Thomas didn't ask again. To this day, the dog still refuses to walk within 10 feet of that spot along the fence. Thomas has stopped trying to understand why. He just changes the route. 3 cemeteries, 3 countries, 3 people who never expected an ordinary evening to turn into something they still can't explain. If there's one thing every story we cover on this channel has in common, it's this. The scariest stories aren't the ones with monsters. They're the ones where something almost makes sense. Right up until it doesn't. If this video kept you up a little later than you planned, do us a favor and hit subscribe. New true horror stories go up every week here on Midnight Masquerade. And if you've got a story of your own, something that happened to you or to someone you know, in a cemetery, a forest, an empty road at night, anything that still doesn't sit right with you, send it our way. Your story could be the one we tell next.